You may remember last week I said these early parts of Genesis are difficult to translate, with more varied versions found floating around than just about any other passage. And what they actually mean and trying to figure out what that might be can be equally difficult with equally varied thoughts about this. At some point in our lives, someone, maybe a Sunday school teacher, probably told us what these stories mean, at least from the teacher's perspective, and we either believed them, and we still do, or maybe the explanations given made no sense to us at the time, or maybe later in our lives we just can't buy those interpretations anymore, and unaware of other interpretive possibilities, it's easy just to dismiss these stories as having no meaning for our lives and give them little more thought. I mean, really, when did you last think about these stories? I mean, really think about what they actually say. If you were in church school class this morning, perhaps you did. For instance, when according to the story, the only living creatures there with God were water creatures and birds, then God says, "Let us make humankind in our image to be like us." Have you ever wondered who God is talking to? Some say God is talking to the angelic hosts, whoever they are. Others say this plural usage simply reflects polytheism or the belief in many gods that was very common in these ancient creation stories and kind of like something that just somehow got left in there. Some Christians talk about the Trinity, saying God in three persons was there from the start. And this conversation is an internal relational conversation between the Creator, the Redeemer, and the Holy Spirit. In the first two verses of Genesis last Sunday, we noted that at the very, very beginning was God, represented by both the feminine and the masculine. So I've been wondering, when God says, let's make humankind in our image to be like us, if maybe just possibly the masculine and the feminine aspects of God are the conversation partners in whose image we are created. God and spirit, both male and female, equally important aspects of the identity of each and every one of us, with both the so-called feminine and masculine parts of us needing to be developed if we are to be whole persons. I also mentioned last week how these texts invite us to use all of the knowledge that we have at our disposal to understand the meaning of these words for our lives. And psychological studies, at least some of them, seem to indicate the importance of embracing and nurturing the so-called feminine and masculine parts of ourselves if we are to be whole persons. Otherwise, they say, we limit ourselves and we limit others, trying to fit people neatly into certain gender expectations, those stereotypical boxes that we make as we define one another based on apparent sex identification. But at any rate, the story begins to paint a picture of true human identity. Humanity created in the image of God, the divine image, created in the divine image as female and male, reflecting divinity, made to be like God, responsible to watch over and care for fish and birds, cattle and wild animals, everything that crawls on the ground, responsible for the earth and every living thing. Some reason that from this story, human persons, those creatures created in God's image at the very first to be like God, the creatures that were created very last in the first story, were created last because of the crowning glory of divine handiwork. Now, if we use the same reasoning in the second creation story that you also heard this morning, just a few verses later, we are led to some particularly interesting conclusions. In the second story, God fashions a creature from clay or dust or soil, and traditionally we call this creature Adam. And then comes a beautiful, bountiful garden that God plants, and every kind of tree, lots of water and river and streams. This new living being will have plenty to eat and drink, And if you remember last week, I suggested that God had an evaluative process going on, at least in the first story, declaring the work of each new day to be good. And it seems to indicate that creation has the possibility of being changed into something better if it's not quite up to standard. It seems to be sort of an ongoing, evolving process that God has going here. And something similar is happening in the second creation story. We have a creature of some form who is given lots of water and plants to sustain life, to enjoy. The creature even has a good job, meaningful work to do, cultivating and caring for the land. And then God makes another creative move. Deciding it's not good for this creature to be alone, God says, I'll make a good companion for the creature. So God goes back to work, shaping and forming more creatures from the soil, the various wild beasts, the birds of the air, cattle, maybe even a loving dog or an independent cat or two, bringing each creature to receive a name. But still, there's not really a fitting companion for God's first made creature. So God makes his creature fall asleep, and pretty soon we have humanity, both female and male. Now, traditionally, many interpretations of the second creation story use this text to explain how the creation of the man first shows the higher value and worth of men and establishes why men are to be in charge. Others, more benevolently, explain the creation of the man first doesn't exactly make men more important, though it sort of does. It doesn't exactly mean men and women are not equal, they just have different functions that are often difficult to in which it's often difficult to discern equality. But either way you go, the man is the decision maker in charge unless in his wisdom he chooses to delegate. Women are companions, helpers, sidekicks, second-class citizens at best. At worst, sexualized objects of no real value to be dominated by men, subject to whatever treatment men so choose. But if we follow our reasoning from the first story, with the most valuable being created last, woman is the last created being, the crowning work of God, the crowning glory of divine handiwork. The man is at the bottom of the heap, below even the various wild beasts, all the birds of the air, the cattle, and actually even below the plants and the trees.